Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. Just months after Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba, he visited Washington in April of 1959 and received a warm welcome. Castro placed a wreath at the base of both the Lincoln and Jefferson memorials and was photographed looking up in seemingly admiration of both U.S. presidents. For more than the next half century, our relationship has gone steadily downhill. We continue to impose counterproductive economic sanctions, embargoes, travel, and financial restrictions. What the hell? The population of Cuba is only 11 million people. Let's discuss. Well, warm greetings. We have our guest, Vijay Prashad, back. We had you on, Vijay, a year ago with your book on the withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the fragility of U.S. power. So it's about you do a book a year, I think, and
Okay, yeah,
you're
with
on.
Noam Chomsky is not bad, I must say. Yeah.
And we're going to talk to you about your new book, but I don't know if you've gone on to artificial intelligence and done a search. This is Copilot, so this is the new AI. And it says Vijay Prasad has written and edited numerous books. According to information available, he has authored or edited 72 books.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's a
I
great number.
You can't believe everything you read on the
Impressive.
internet, but that's pretty impressive.
I
That's a big
suppose. I
number.
didn't even know that. Thanks for that number.
Well, okay. So I want to before we get to the book that we're going to chat with you about, I read your it's a book on Cuba. This book is just so good. The Washington Bullets, and it reminds me a lot of of Vincent Bevan's book on the Jakarta method, because this book is it's only you wrote it during the pandemic, is that correct?
To be frank with you, I wrote this book in 2.5 weeks um,
Unreal.
because I was so angry about the coup against Evo Morales that I took my phone for a walk with me and I started talking, and the opening of the book just came to me like, what is the price of a bullet? The cost of the this, the that, the taxi for the assassin, the hotel room, the flight, but that's not just the cost. There's also the cost to the people who lose their leader and blah, blah. I just went on a rant with my phone. I came home, I transcribed that, and I said, well, I've been studying the CIA for years. I've interviewed a number of important CIA leaders, including most spectacularly Chuck Cogan, who was the station chief in Central Asia during some of the key period. And I just kept going, and I wrote this book like that.
Well, if it makes you feel good, I live right next to a beautiful park in Tacoma, and I put this book on Alexa and listened to it, and I binged the thing and just like, top to bottom. It's a great book if you're just looking at a general Marxist view of imperialism and our intrusion on the world, and that gets us to your new book, which is on Cuba.
Beautiful. I'm so happy to see you holding it.
Oh, this was okay. So you are buddies with Noam Chomsky. Would you say he kind of mentors you and other intellectuals? Or
Well,
what's your relationship with him?
okay, so Pat, this is a very complicated issue because Noam is not really a teacher, in the sense that he puts a heavy imprint on you. He's a colleague, I think, to everybody. I feel that deeply. He respects people, he respects their ideas. He respects people so much that if one wrote to him when he was in better health, he would write you back. You know, he was well known for writing people back and so on. Really respectful of all questions. Obviously, was searing sometimes in his answers, but he took people seriously. So what I found is that we've developed over the course of 3 decades or so really good friendship because he, you know, when he was younger, he traveled quite a bit. He went to Vietnam during the war. He went, in fact, to Cambodia during the bombing, to the Plain of Jars. You know, he traveled to Turkey, traveled to Lebanon, traveled in Latin America, and so on. But in the last maybe 15, 20 years, he wasn't traveling much at all. And he began to rely on people that he trusted who traveled. And I travel a lot for reporting as a journalist. That's my main living. And I used to, you know, write to him initially, you know, write emails. Then I started to call him, talk to him, say, I'm in Haiti. This is what I'm seeing. He would tell me, this is what I remember seeing 20 years ago, or this is what I read in the New York Times recently. What do you feel about that? And in fact, I think what's interesting is in the projects where we've actually done something together, we come with different methodologies. He has a great reading, you know, memory of the archive of the US foreign policy establishment. He's read their memoirs, he's read the documents, he's read the newspapers. I mean, he knows what Kissinger has written. If you read his review of Kissinger's work, it's actually extraordinary because he reads these people seriously. I don't read them as seriously as he does. That's just not my thing. You know, reading Henry Kissinger makes me want to faint and die and vomit all over the book. But he's read it all super patiently. I'm much more interested in traveling around Cuba, talking to ordinary people about their lives and so on. So actually, our work complements each other. And that, I think, is what happened in the withdrawal, where I had been in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. And then it really helped us in this book.
Well, I have a confession to make. When I got my first electric car, I decided to get vanity plates, and they say Chomsky. So,
That's funny.
and the good thing is that the police don't know who the hell Chomsky is. Otherwise, I'm sure I'd be,
Or they're
that
scared of him, and
yeah.
in that sense, scared of you. So,
Good. Greg, what did you think of On Cuba?
Well, Cuba's been part of my life since I was a youngster, and that's a long time ago. And I've followed it for years. And I had some small involvement with the Cuban Five, and my friends were deeply involved with the Cuban Five, my closest friends. And I've just been partisan for Cuba forever. And where it is today, in terms of the abuse that's been heaped upon it by the United States, is just appalling. And anything we can do to bring the attention to the American people of the fate of Cuba. I've been there, I guess, at least once, maybe twice. I've sent my kids there. It's a beautiful country, a beautiful ideology, a leader who's passed, Fidel, who's one of the great figures of the 20th century into the 21st century. And what we're doing to the Cuban people is just appalling. So I hope that the name Chomsky, I don't know that Chomsky's been a leading light in terms of bringing attention to the fate of Cuba, but he's been supportive. But having his name, which is a big name, and of course Vijay's name's very large too among the left, to remind us of what Cuba is suffering today is so important. And as I mentioned to you earlier, Pat, there's an initiative by, forgive my I don't speak Spanish, but Ignacio Ramanet, who was a biographer of Fidel, who now wrote an open letter to Biden, urging that they drop this insanity of state terrorism, which they've charged Cuba with. So I would urge other people, maybe we could put up a link to it, but other people to write and support that movement, because to call Cuba a state terrorist is a abuse of language, abuse of logic, a country that fought terrorists in Africa, a country that fought terrorists in its own country, U.S.-sponsored terrorists, that sent its security people to Venezuela to fight U.S. terrorism, is just appalling.
Yeah, yeah. Vijay, I liked your book where you just started by saying that you would have conversations with Noam and you recorded these. And at some point in time, either you or he said, "Why don't we just make a book about these clean them up, make a book about it." Tell us about that process and how you ended up taking phone calls and turning it into such a good overview of where Cuba is right now.
Yeah, I mean, as Greg was saying, Chomsky hasn't really had a big presence in this conversation for a whole lot of reasons. I mean, he went to Cuba in 2004. We write a little bit about it in the book and so on. But he was very interested in making some sort of statement. So initially, it began with him and I writing a short piece saying Cuba should be removed from the state sponsor of terrorism list. And, after that, we continued to talk and I started recording. We did I don't know, maybe 10, 11 Zooms, which I just recorded where, I'd ask him questions like, when do you think this began? Did this begin in 1959? He said, oh, no, it began with the revolution, the United States Revolution. You have Adams saying this, and then Monroe saying this, and from memory, he started saying these things, and when I basically printed out the lot of the transcript, it was just a little too confusing because I would return to things later, and I thought it would be wooden to put together the Monroe answer. It just didn't work. And I think it could have worked had I taken a lot more time to finesse the transcript. So when I spoke to him and said, look, we have a really good account here. The problem is it's uneven because, you are so much more well versed in like what happened in the Bay of Pigs. He knew that stuff like the back of his hand. I mean, because I went and checked the sources. He really knew that stuff. And then, I was much more interested in like the doctors, and I'd interviewed doctors in the hot wards during the COVID period and so on in Costa Rica. And so I was interested in that story, which he didn't know much about. So then I said, look, why don't we try to make it a different way? And he said, look, why don't you just take everything and write, use our language, my language, your language, write a thing, and then I'll just run through it and edit it. And that's basically what I did. I sat and I took big pile of papers and I made an account. And then because I felt that it would be nice because he is, obviously not only the senior partner, but I mean, he's Chomsky. There are figurines of him in shops. I thought it'll be nice to have block quotes with his voice on certain issues. So every once in a while in the book, you get a block quote where Chomsky is speaking in his voice. But for the rest, it's an amalgam. I mean,
Right.
yes, I admit it was me putting it together, but there's a lot of his words, my words, and so on.
Let's go back to the beginning. In 1959, Fidel came to the United States after the revolution, met with Vice President Nixon, went to the Lincoln and Jefferson memorials. It just, there could have been a relationship that was positive, and yet he has been the poster child for communism, the horrible spread of the disease of communism all through the Southern Hemisphere. And it's interesting, he didn't even consider himself a communist. I mean, he wanted to take his country back and make it better, and we kind of made him the boogeyman communist. Am I getting that correct?
I mean, it's to some extent correct because Fidel was a very complicated man. People sometimes say it was Che Guevara who was the real communist because Che, when he was living in Guatemala in 1953-54, was living with a communist. She was a real Marxist, and she trained Che in Marxism, and then he brings that to his friends, the Castros. But it's not that Fidel was unaware of these ideas, because when Fidel, for instance, was there in Colombia in 1948, and the Bogotazo breaks out after Gaitan, the great liberal, is assassinated. You know, the OAS is meeting there. You would have seen some of that in Washington Bullets. And Fidel found himself on the streets and so on. It's not that Fidel was out of that conversation, but it is true that Fidel understood that he needed an agenda that was practical. And so in 1953, when he is arrested after the failed rising at Moncada, and he's put on trial, he goes and makes that amazing speech, "History will absolve me." And if you read that speech, Fidel lays out the program of the Cuban Revolution. He says, we come to power, we're going to do this, the practical things. These are the things. Now, they're obviously inspired by the left. But in fact, what he's arguing for is the sovereignty of Cuba. He's not arguing for socialism in some abstract sense. He's arguing for the establishment of sovereignty, which is a necessary precondition for building socialism. If you don't have sovereignty, you can't build socialism. And so that's what they start to do in 59. It's not that he's not a communist or is a communist. It's that he is definitely a Cuban, and he wanted Cuba to control Cuba. And that was seen as arrogant and disobedient. And the United States just couldn't allow that. I mean, if he had come out and said, I'm a socialist, it might have been easier to deal with him. But he said, no, I want to establish the sovereignty. And this is exactly what Jacob Arbenz had tried to do in Guatemala in the 1950s and was overthrown in a coup d'etat in 1954, which, as I said, Che Guevara saw right up there front and center. And this is what prepared them. When they took power in 1959, they started the road to sovereignty, but they built their defenses. They armed the people. They prepared the people ideologically. They said that they will attempt a coup as they did in Guatemala. And indeed, when it did come in the Bay of Pigs, they were ready. The people, I mean, I've visited, as I'm sure you have visited the Bay of Pigs. You talk to the old timers. I mean, they would go out running with a gun now to defend their beaches against an invasion, not for any other reason than that the revolution evoked the immense power of Cuban patriotism. With the whole excavation of Jose Marti and Cuba standing for itself, extraordinary process, which was more important as the precondition to socialism than putting up a red flag and saying we are communists.
Right. One of the first podcasts we did was with a friend of ours. This is way, number 13, way back. We looked at the book Exterminate the Brutes. There had been a documentary that was created from that, and that's it all stems from, and you mentioned this, the Monroe Doctrine's what, a couple hundred years old? Are we coming on
exactly 200 years old? Yeah.
Okay.
1823. Yeah.
And it's just pretty simple that we're imperialists, that we do what we want. If there's hypocrisy within our foreign policy, then, shit happens. And that we're selective in where we enforce things and where we don't. It always tends to follow the money. And, like you said, when Fidel came and took power in Cuba, that was one of his primary directives, is that we want our own sovereignty, and we'll work with you, but we're not your surrogate. We're not your beachhead. We're not your, and that just didn't play well, right? Is that what really lit the fuse for all this?
Firstly, Exterminate the Brutes by Sven Lindqvist is one of the really fine books of our time.
Right.
Lindqvist was a very, very important Swedish writer. who wrote a number of important anti-colonial books. He wrote a book, by the way, if you're interested, called A History of Bombing, which is one of the best books about aerial warfare. It's an extraordinary book about how colonialists used the skies to obliterate people. The first aerial bombardment against the Libyans in 1911. Imagine that. The war against Libya was on the 100th anniversary of the bombing by the Italians of Libya in 1911. It's just an uncomfortable truth. And in those early years, from 1911 to 1923 or so, a doctrine was created, and Lindquist uncovers that, which says that aerial bombardment, however brutal, because they knew it was brutal, aerial bombardment is pedagogical. In other words, it teaches the natives to fear the colonizer. That's how these people wrote about it. Arthur Bomber Harris of the Royal Air Force had a doctrine of inculcating fear among people who were bombed from the sky because they had no way of reaching you. It's the most dishonorable form of warfare. Lindquist's book, that's another brilliant book of his. But you mentioned Raoul Peck's film, Exterminate the Brutes, that came out with Lindquist. I mean, basically inspired in some ways by Lindquist's book. I mean, Raoul Peck, comes with all the history of Haiti in his body and carries that with him. He is Haitian. He was in the Haitian government. That film, that series is extraordinary because it just tears into the idea that basic belief in using violence against lessers, people sought to be lesser, that basic belief remains intact today. It's not that we left it behind in the 19th century, 18th century, or something like that. It remains intact today that, you can just cavalierly destroy people. I mean, the war in the genocide in Gaza, it's not a war. A war is when there are two militaries. If you read Sven Lindquist's book, History of Bombing, and then you just think about the situation in Gaza today, it's a perfect book for that, because what Arthur Bomber Harris was saying, in the 1920s, which is you use aerial bombardment to teach people to obey you. And that's exactly what the Israelis are doing. They're aerially bombing up people who have no defenses to teach them their place in the world. It's pedagogical. It's mind-blowing. And by the way, using the word pedagogy is so cruel, Pat, because just as we speak, today is the 19th of September, while we're speaking, just yesterday, the Israelis bombed another school, which was a shelter, which had been designated a shelter by the United Nations. Pedagogical bombing, and you're bombing schools. Something quite off-putting just about that, about how things haven't really gone away, those old exterminate the brute mentalities.
Greg and I were talking before you got on about Haitians eating hot dogs, and Greg, you had indicated that a lot of the problems with Cuba came from the audacity of Haitians to push back. What were your thoughts about that?
Capitalism has never forgiven Haiti for having a revolution. They'll never forgive Toussaint Louverture, and they're still paying a price today. I mean, it's sick, paying a price for daring to have a revolution against slavery and against French domination. But I think about terror, because I'm glad Vijay brought up the bombings, because they start, of course, in Libya. Then after World War I, the Brits did it again to the Iraqis, and it goes on and on. Bomber Harris to our moment. I was just watching a documentary on Pearl Harbor. Nothing very sophisticated, but when they retaliated by bombing Japan with that infamous raid that was conducted with the B-25s, I forget the general's name. It was just a gesture. But of the 5 bombs on each plane, 1 was an incendiary. And that's the kind of thinking, terrorism, that's behind those kind of bombings. I mean, I'd go a little further than Vijay and call it terrorism. And when people in this country throw the word terrorism around, like they have some sense of what it means, they forget this is terrorism. This is meant to cower people, to make them bend down in front of powerful forces. It's an incredible phenomenon. Can I say something though regarding Fidel? I'm very prickly about Fidel's legacy. Anti-communism in this country is so strong that we go back and look at 59 and we say, was he a communist? Wasn't he communist? The reality is, in almost the rest of the world, a middle-class family like the Castros, there would be university students. There'd be someone in the family who was a communist. Raul was in a young communist league. I think he attended one of the first youth festivals. That was not in a family like that. They would discuss communism. It would be like discussing the other political party in most countries in the West. But here, it's the lightning rod. And so I think my reading is that Fidel wasn't a member of the party. The Communist Party in Cuba was an important party, a big factor in that revolution. But I think the connections were there, and so what? I mean, that's what it is. It's the way it should be here.
I mean, that's interesting. I mean, the fact is that, it really, in a way, it's not a relevant question. Because the most important question is that he was certainly against the Batista regime and its tentacles backwards and forwards with the US-based mob, with the mob of the CIA and so on. All those mafias and gangsters in the US had their tentacles in Batista, and Castro stood against all of them. In fact, in cutting the tentacles from Miami and from Washington, he invoked the wrath of the beast. I mean, that actually is what it is. It was less who is Castro and more who is this beast that was dominating Cuba. Because, whether Castro had been a full-fledged Marxist-Leninist or, an Arbenz-like liberal, he would have been struck down had he stood up against the beast. And it's the character of the beast that I'm interested in, because, it's a very simple thing I'm going to say. People have analyzed this for years. Why did the United States? But very simple thing. Several times in our conversation, Noam used the word disobedience. Cuba is disobedient. And I was like, why are you using the word disobedient? Because that's patronizing. I mean, it's a country, not a child, right? And he said, oh, I'm not using the word disobedient. I'm quoting the word. I said, why are you quoting it from? He said, well, if you go back and look at these kinds of State Department reports, and then he gave me a few ideas where to look. He said, you'll find two keywords, disobedience and contagion. And go and have a look. So I of course, dutifully went online, and most of the US government reports are fortunately online. And I found it. It was exactly correct. That in these documents, most of them he accurately identified. The United States government said that Cuba was being disobedient, and they worried that Cuban disobedience would be contagious. And in fact, that was the key issue, the disobedience. Was it the character of the disobedience? What kind of disobedience? I don't think they cared. They just didn't want the disobedience. And, I went and I'd looked at other things, other work. It's very interesting. You mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. That's 1823. But don't forget, Cuba was a Spanish colony till 1898. Right through the 19th century, the slave owners of the Mississippi River Valley had economists of their own. Their economists, and their economists were very interested in building a Mississippi River Valley Caribbean economic complex. So all the way from the upper Mississippi in Missouri and wherever it's comes from, all the way down to the Mississippi Delta, and then coming into the Caribbean, they were interested in islands, particularly like Cuba, which could become part of the whole Mississippi River Valley economic complex, for slavery and for the economic development. So Cuba was a desirable object right through the 19th century. And what the what the Cuban Revolution of 59 does is it sort of overturns this dream and suggests, hey, listen, we have our own dream. And that statement, we have our own dream, is the highest form of disobedience. You can't have your own dream. You have to dream what we dream. Our dream is called the American dream, and our dream should be your dream. Even if it looks like a nightmare, our dream is your dream. If you have your own dream, that might curtail our dream, and that's unacceptable. So, disobedience, contagion, simple words, in fact, help really explain in a nutshell the heart of the strategy, or at least the feeling of why Cuba must be Cuban Revolution must be overthrown.
Yeah, and those words certainly fit with Venezuela, with Nicolas Maduro. And I don't know what to think about. When I first heard about the elections, I thought, oh my God, they're all rigged. It's horrible. And then I listened to Carlos Guillermo on Midwest Marks, who actually went down and was an observer there and said, they were by and large, they've got a pretty good system for elections. And, but they're disobedient. They have our oil and our natural resources. Jesus, and I don't know. What are your thoughts about the parallels between what's going on in Venezuela and the fact that they are kind of sticking their finger in the eye of U.S. imperialism? Have you been involved with that situation much?
Well, I first went to Venezuela in 1995 and have covered, I think, almost all the elections. I was there for 2 weeks during this election as well.
Oh.
And well, what is one to say? In 1998, when Chavez prevailed, then the opposition, largely made up of the traditional right, Acción Democrática and COPE, which are, the typical Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, they at the time didn't say there was fraud. They accepted that Chavez had won, grudgingly, I must say. In 2004, there was a recall referendum against Chavez. It's the first time I'd heard, before the election, the opposition say there's fraud. Never heard it before. And then every single election since 2004, they've called fraud. In 2020, December, I was interviewing members of COPE, Acción Democrática, by now set aside because they are the traditional right. The real new force is the far right, led by, at the time, characters like Leopoldo Lopez, Maria Corina Machado, and so on. So in 2020, these traditional right parties and a few evangelical parties that I interviewed all said the same thing. They said, look, the Chavez crowd has at least 50% of the vote. After Hugo Chavez died, and in the first election subsequent to that in 2014, Nicolas Maduro won 51% of the vote. His opposition, Henry Capriles, 49%. Very tight election. And what these people said, now this is 6 years later after that election, that was probably the accurate result. They said that the right, and least of all the far right, can't get more than 51%. That's going to be hard for the far right because Chavismo has such a grip on society. Chavez's revolutionary process has done so much for people. Very unlikely that you could get more than 51%. This election, very interestingly, beforehand, a poll was released which said that the opposition was at 70%. Now, Venezuela is not a country of polls. It's just not possible to poll there, for lots of reasons. And I don't want to get into them. But it's just not easy to make polls there. I've seen the electorate. It's very hard to, how are you going to get to people? Anyway, where did this poll come from? It came from a group called Edison Research, which is based in New Jersey.
One group.
Pardon?
Just one group.
Yeah,
all of the New York Times reports about horrible problems with the election came from one source.
Correct. Edison Research, based in New Jersey.
Yeah.
Now, they have a website, and you can go to their website, and it's freely available. There are two things I want to point out about Edison Research. First is, if you look at the actual poll that they released, it has no methodology. It doesn't tell you how they got the information. It doesn't really tell you what the sample size was, the error rate, basic things that psephologists talk about. Psephologists are those who watch elections and conduct polls. It's a science, and there's no scientific information there. That's the first thing. They just made a claim, 70 to 30. Secondly, if you look at the clients of Edison Research, because it's a freely available website, it's very interesting that all their clients are CIA contractors, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, and so on. There's a big list. You can Google each one of their clients, and each one of their clients is basically has a history of being US funded, government funded, and having been a client of or contractor of the CIA. It's a very suspicious organization, Edison Research. I tried to phone them, couldn't get through. It's interesting. Washington Post, New York Times, El País, they all use this poll to say that there's a variance between this poll and the actual result. In fact, if you look at the actual result from the election and compare it to the 2014 election, 51 to 49, it's actually pretty close, 52 to 44 or something. That's about where the population is. Now, obviously, no election is without its problems. There will be some voter irregularities here, there, and everywhere. You can latch on to 20 irregularities. That doesn't mean that you could have won the election fair and square. There is a problem that the right has, that the right wants to take away the social state that the Bolivarians have created. People don't want to vote for austerity. They already have a hard time with the US sanctions and so on. But I don't think they have an appetite to give up their homes, Mission Vivienda, and so on. I don't think that's there, So, yeah, I mean, I just think that there's something absurd in the way in which this conversation about the elections happened in the corporate media.
Well, it just didn't the opposition want to nationalize all of the oil companies and turn them over to? I mean, you can the lines are pretty clear to draw here between who's benefiting from all of this. And I agree with you. I think that there are some problems with the government there, but it's elevated, amplified histrionics make it the boogeyman that it doesn't deserve to be. So that's my general thought. I don't know much about it, but there you go. Hey, back to Cuba. I have a good friend that's Cuban, married a British guy who, by the way, we had Tariq Ali on to talk about his Churchill book, and we argued incessantly with my Brit friend and I about whether Tariq Ali was correct in that.
Well, Tariq is writing his memoir, so quickly book him to come on the show.
God,
that's going to be fun.
He is a treasure. He's a treasure.
Yeah.
And his book on Churchill, I had no idea. I had read the Eric Larson book and others, and I thought, well, this guy had some redeeming value. Well, he's a Kissinger war criminal. I don't know how else to say it.
Worse than that. I mean, because Kissinger, at least because he was born later, understood how to be slightly discreet. Churchill had no discretion. He just said, I don't like the savages.
Yeah, right. Very, very racist. Of course, with a lot of racism back then.
Yeah,
anyway, I don't want to talk.
Kissinger held his tongue. It was Nixon who was racist on the tapes. Kissinger held his tongue and said, "Yes, Mr. President, yes."
God. And you look at what they did with the India, the years there. Anyway, don't get me going on the Brits. On the Brits, my wife just got back from Ireland. Greg's going to Ireland in a week or two to.
2 weeks, 20 days, yeah. Again,
tell Vijay about that.
I've been invited to speak keynote. Actually, Irish Communist Party invited me. I spoke in 2017 on a Bolshevik revolution there at their behest and for a Connolly festival. And they invited me back to do a talk on imperialism for the
Excellent.
students. But if I could, because I don't want to use all your time on Cuba, we're on the verge of an election here, and I know we have a big problem in this country with politics and where it's going. It's very depressing, quite depressing. And one of the discussions in the left always is the right and what the right is. And I was struck by a couple of articles on Tricontinental recently, which I thought were really insightful and interesting. One of them was the weakness of progressive Latin American governments, which talks specifically about Boric and Chile, and I think that's a great example. But I was impressed with Daniel Yadui. How do you say Yadui? How do you say his name? In any case, he wrote as follows: the political center, whether it's center left or center right variances, has been alienated, alternating in governments around the world for decades without resolving the most pressing issues of the people. And he talks about the collapse of that effort, but that the left remains fragmented between political parties and social movements. Rebellious and truly transformative discourse has almost disappeared, and struggles in humanized capitalism have become widespread. And he talks about the rise of the right and how there's not been a response to it, and it's filled a void. And in this recent 10th thesis on the far right, you talk about liberalism and the far right, and you're dismissive of the constant talk in America about fascism and the far right. I wonder if you'd elaborate on that. I think there's some great insights in both of those articles.
I mean, this is the worst time of the year to have a conversation about politics in the United States, because as you come closer to a US election, the political oxygen disappears and people just sit on one side or the other of the fence and don't want to have a serious conversation about advancing things. I mean, I saw the other day, Angela Davis made a statement saying Kamala Harris is better than Trump because, then the left can have some sort of pressure on her. I mean, I've heard that argument made a million times, and it just rings hollow to me. I don't understand where it comes from, because I don't understand what the leverage is that the left would have on a Democratic president. Strikes me the left has zero leverage. It depends what you mean by the left. I mean, maybe certain trade unions can come to the table, but that's not leverage. That's just access. Those are different things. Access is not the same as leverage. Maybe that if a Democrat is in the White House, a left liberal activist can be invited for, I don't know, Christmas or whatever, but they don't get to sit and make policy. And I think that's a misunderstanding of what it means to have proximity to certain political forces. Proximity, again, is it maybe giving you access, but not leverage. So anyway, given all that, it's pretty clear to me that in our time, there are some structural features beneath the surface level politics that need to be taken seriously. Psychosocial changes taking place, precarious labor as it increases in advanced societies creates its own form of crisis. It creates loneliness among people, a desire for community. It opens the door to a great deal of frustrations. People don't work with the same people because they are precariously employed. They don't go to work and meet and have the same friends. They can't go to the bar at the same time. That song from Cheers of Another Generation, go where everybody knows my name. Nobody knows your name, man, because the bartender is different every day. It's a precarious job. Or you go at different times because you don't know when your shift is going to be. For all those reasons, there's a psychosocial crisis in advanced societies. And that has produced its own problems because, on the one side, neoliberalism, which is really what liberals have become, is neoliberals. Their main policy position is austerity. They drive austerity on the population. They increase the basis of precariousness and so on. And then because the social democrats have been invalidated. Most real liberals have become neoliberals. The right is no longer the traditional right. That they might exist here and there, but they are not influential. The real right is this new right, or the, of a special kind. This far right of a special kind is the real right now. And this is represented around the world by characters who want to basically prey on loneliness, on social loneliness. And Trump is a master of that. He assembles communities, but doesn't build community. He assembles communities. And that's not the same as building a community, because to build a society, to build a community, you need certain structures in place. You don't have a society in most advanced countries. Margaret Thatcher was right. There are no societies, only individuals. I mean, that might have been silly when she said it, but it was exactly the direction that she set societies toward, the breakdown of social institutions. That really did happen. And the far right of a special kind has a very acute way of mobilizing that loneliness into a politics. This doesn't make the two of them, the neoliberals and the far right of a special kind, far from each other. In fact, in my opinion, they are, they basically are like intertwined snakes, in a dance. And it's us that are getting bitten. And when you say, well, let's pick one snake over the other, that's okay as an electoral choice. I know people have to make those electoral choices. But, okay, you keep Trump out, okay, this time, and Harris comes in. But Harris will do a whole series of things which will deepen the support for Trump next time. And you go back and forth, digging a grave for society, because the society is getting further and further eviscerated, So I don't know. I hate having the conversation during the US election year, because at the end of the day, lots of people, I know not the two of you, but a lot of people would like you to say, but on the right in the last minute, the loneliest place in the world is the election booth. And, well, I suppose you're going to have to vote for ... I really don't care. Okay. I mean, I don't care, because when it comes to a country like Cuba, it doesn't matter who's the president. Now, somebody might come back and say, well, but Obama wanted to. Yes, Obama was a little unusual on that, but Biden wasn't. Biden did not reverse Trump's policies. Clinton was horrible, both to Cuba and to Haiti. It's not a Democrat-Republican issue. It's true. Obama did make an opening. He was pushed by big business, but he also did do it. And that's commendable. And I hope whoever is the president next will put a red pen through the state sponsor on terrorism list, and so on. Obama did do a good job on that. I would agree. But I don't think that had to do because he was a Democrat. I think that had to do with he got pressure from business, didn't want to be outflanked by European business. And also, I think that there was something emotional for Obama about this. But I can't be sure. I don't know Obama. My roommate in college used to play basketball with him. That's about as close, as I got to him.
Just a follow-up question. This is all true, but this right phenomena is everywhere. In Europe, it's everywhere. Even in India, we have the same phenomena. So what's the response to this? I mean, I couldn't agree. I agree with I think what you said is astute and insightful. But what's the left going to do?
Yeah, I mean, our goal has got to be to build the independent strength of the left. I mean, and I don't mean this electorally necessarily. In a country like the United States, for instance, trade union density is way down. We need to have an organized society. People need to be organized. Those who are active and willing to transform society need to be organizing people, need to bring people into movie clubs, Cuba solidarity groups, a million different forms of organization, combat loneliness through going out there and building community. And then let's see what happens, but this is not an electoral issue. Like, I understand. If I was, voting in this election in the US, I'd vote for Jill Stein probably, or for Claudia de la Cruz, in order to build the independent strength of the left electorally. But that's not how you build the left. You don't build the left in the ballot box. You build the left by going out there and organizing society, not just in trade unions or political parties, but in groups. One reason we wrote this book is we hoped it would rejuvenate the Cuba solidarity movement. It would be great if in every city in the United States, a Cuba solidarity group was revitalized. I would love it if they, circulated PDFs of this book and did reading groups and, Xerox pages of it for people to argue about. I mean, society needs to be built. You can't build socialism without a society. That's the key thing. It would be ridiculous to have a anti-social socialism. You need a society. And in many of the advanced countries, society is falling apart. I think who would disagree with that?
Right.
Trump is a great reference of a collapsing social order.
Hey, I want to get back to my Cuban friend. She left, her family was in Cuba in the 60s, barely made it out, went through the revolution, lost all of their property, lost their stores, lost everything, came over here to the United States, and every one of them is just this remarkable person. Her father, her uncles were professors, they are all successful. But boy, do they hate Castro for what happened way back when. And I think of the power of the Cubans in Florida in really shaping all of the politics of Florida, similar to how the Jewish lobby has the power of control over our Congress. Is there any reconciliation with that? I mean, when I hear her tell these stories, and she went back to Cuba recently, it's just horrible how what she remembered as a child, this country was, how wonderful it is, and how beaten down and poor it is now. And she's got a point, you know.
Well,
She should express
yeah.
loss for what a wonderful people and country it was. I don't know.
Well, but the issue is, there are always class perspectives. I don't know her background or where she came from. I mean, it is always the case that people who had a pretty good life in an unequal society bemoan the attempt to change that. That's just axiomatic. If you were a petty aristocrat, let's say in Russia in 1916, and then the revolution happens, and you lose your whatever small, benefits you have, and
Right.
you are that it's a terrible situation. A middle class family, let's say, which is run out of town, yeah, may not look. Nobody told the middle class to leave Cuba. People chose to leave because they were also scared what's going to happen and so on. I don't know the exact biographical details, but of course, depending on your perspective, your class perspective, things could be shocking. Yeah, because you say, well, when I was young, we used to have big hotels in Havana, and my birthday was celebrated at a hotel, and there was can dancing next door, and there was like glass sculptures and champagne, and well, that's a mob hotel, and there was also Cubans being terribly exploited in that, and so on. It's again a class perspective.
Right.
But also beyond that, what you talked about in terms of people looking to their homelands and so on, there is a classic form of Americanization that takes place. People who move to the United States, first generation migrants, frequently develop antipathy to where they came from, because you can't afford to have failed. If I'm a migrant, I come to the United States from Guatemala, and even whatever my life is like in the US, it has to be a success, because I can't afford to have failed in making this dramatic shift, leaving Guatemala, the immense difficulties of getting papers, coming to the US and so on, and then having to say I failed or that I'm emotionally less satisfied in the US than in Guatemala, that's not going to happen. You're going to say my life in the US is better. And people glamorize the United States based on that and then turn around and say, look, my homeland is a mess. This is a cliche. It's not just Cuba. You can meet immigrants from all over the world. I mean, it's precisely immigrants into the US because it's so hard to migrate to the US. You leave so much behind. People leave their languages behind and so on. And they come in and there's this real desperation to say that my life in the US is a success. So it's not just about Cuba. This is a migrants problem. And I think, in the case that you mentioned, it overlaps with Cuba because the person is from Cuba. But I mean, there are lots of Cubans in Cuba who would say, well, it's a bad situation for us, but we have our dignity. We are free people. It's a bad, like, that's the reason why in the book we compare the counter-revolution of Haiti in 1957, when Papa Doc Duvalier comes to power, and the Cuban Revolution 2 years later. Because despite the fact that Haiti is, quote unquote free, and Cuba is under an embargo and has been so for over 60 years, the life situation in Cuba is a lot better than Haiti. And, and I know exactly why.
Well, listen, thank you so much. I just want to close with the first sentence of your book. On Cuba is not really about Cuba itself, but it's about the suffocation that the United States has tried to implement against Cuba. Is there any hope? I mean, Jesus, there's 11 million people on this island. Stop it. Just fix it. I don't know.
Well, there is hope, Pat. We just need you and Greg and others to go out there screaming and yelling, not just about this policy, but to revitalize the Cuba solidarity movement. I mean, you're talking to me from your town. I don't know how many people are in a Cuba solidarity movement. I very much hope lots of young people join. I very much hope we build a movement in the United States where people actually have political weight to say, end it now.
Yeah. Any final thoughts, Greg, before we sign off?
No, I agree. We're fortunate here to have a Pittsburgh, Matanzas group that supports Cuba in that way, and it's a multi-class group. It's not just militants or leftists or whatever. It's across people that care enough about human rights, care enough about dignity, that they're getting together and we send stuff to Cuba. And there's another group as well here in Pittsburgh. We're fortunate to have another group, that Global Links, that sends actual material to Cuba. So I quite agree. We need to duplicate that everywhere. And it's a blemish on our history as U.S. citizens. It's a blemish on who we are.
Well, let's do, Greg, help me get some links, and we'll put links in the show notes about that, get people involved with that. Thank you so much. Before I go, I just wanted, you and Greg are two of my favorite Marxists. I got this for you. And my t-shirt says, when life gives you lemons, picture of Marx, destroy capitalism.
Ah, wow. What a great shirt.
Yeah.
And here I was thinking it would say make lemonade.
Yeah,
but there we go.
We're trying to get ready for Greg's friend, Mark's ethical vision, Vanessa Christian Will's a book on Marxism, and I was just telling Greg before we started. I just don't know if I've got the intellectual horsepower to keep up with these high-end academic philosophers, but that's why I've got Greg as my wingman. So there you go.
Yeah.
Well, that is a serious book you had in your hand just now. So good luck with that, guys. And I hope you can get a dumbed down version for me as well. Yeah.
I'm gonna have crib notes all over my hand as I'm trying to, so. All right. Hey, Vijay, thanks so much. This is great.
Thanks a lot. Take care of yourselves.
All right, goodbye.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.